The auditorium in Chicago was dead silent. 50,000 streaming viewers watching through a dozen camera feeds. And Sebastian stood center stage in a suit that cost more than most people's cars, flashing the smile that had gotten him everything he'd never earned. He raised his hand, pressed it against the glowing biometric scanner mounted at the podium. The apex grid was supposed to hum to life in that moment city, infrastructure models blooming across the massive screens behind him, 3 years of my mathematics finally made visible to the world. Instead, the screens flashed a violent, blood red. A flat, mechanical voice filled the auditorium, calm in a way that made the silence underneath it feel enormous. Authorization denied. Original Crayota override. Sebastian froze, hand still pressed to the glass, his smile caught somewhere between confusion and a first flicker of real fear. In the front row, my parents dropped their champagne glasses. I heard the crash even through the feed, sharp and small under 50,000 people's collective intake of breath. The screens flickered once more. Then my face filled every monitor in that building, broadcast live to every investor, from Dubai to London to Tokyo, sitting in a leather chair with my cane resting against the armrest, exactly where I'd left it. "Hello, Sebastian," I said, while my voice carried through the speakers he'd installed himself, in a building he'd never designed a single wall of. "You stole the car," I said, watching his face on my own monitor, watching 3 years of theft finally catch up to him in real time. "But you have absolutely no idea how to drive it." I let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. "Let me show everyone what happens when you turn the key. To understand what happened next, I need to take you back 3 years. Back before the wine, back before the padded room, back to the last night my family still pretended to love me. I finished the apex grid on a Tuesday in March at 4:12 in the morning, the way I finished most things alone, hunched over 3 monitors in an apartment my parents had never once visited, because visiting would have meant acknowledging that the son who couldn't walk without a cane had built something no one else on Earth could replicate. The apex grid wasn't just architecture, it was infrastructure and mathematics, a system for designing city power grids, water systems, and structural load distribution that could cut construction costs by 40% while making buildings measurably safer in seismic zones. I've been working on it for 3 years. I'd rebuilt the core algorithm 11 times. I knew every line of it the way other people know their own heartbeat. I called my mother that morning, told her it was done. "Oh, Julian, that's wonderful," she said, in the particular tone she used for things she didn't understand and had no intention of learning. "Your father wants to celebrate. Dinner Thursday, just family." I remember being genuinely happy when she said that. I remember thinking, for one entire day, that maybe this was the thing that would finally do it. Finally make 3 years of being looked at like a burden with a mind attached feel worth something. I should have noticed how quickly she said yes to celebrating something she'd never once asked to see. The dinner was in the formal room, the one my parents only used for people they wanted to impress. Crystal, not everyday glass. The good silverware. But my mother had even had the cane rack by the door replaced with something that looked less medical, less like evidence that her son needed help walking. Sebastian was there too, of course. 26, effortlessly handsome, a kind of charm that filled the room before he'd said a single interesting thing in it. He'd never finished a single project of his own. Not the restaurant chain, not the app, not the real estate venture our father had bankrolled twice. But he photographed well, and in my family that had always counted for more than what a person actually built. "So," Sebastian said, swirling wine he hadn't earned the taste for, "the big genius project. Finally done, huh?" 3 years, I said. "Yeah, must feel good," he said, in a tone that made it very clear he had no idea what the words he was saying actually meant. My mother poured the wine herself. That should have registered as strange. We had staff for that, always had, but I was tired and hopeful, and hope makes people terrible at noticing small wrong things. "To Julian," my father said, raising his glass, "and to this family's future." I drank. It tasted normal. A little bitter at the back, maybe. But I told myself it was just an unfamiliar vintage, and I was 3 years deep in code and hadn't had wine in longer than I could remember. Halfway through the glass, the room tilted. Not dramatically at first, just a soft, sliding wrongness, like the floor had developed a very slight grade I hadn't noticed before. I set my glass down, missed the coaster. Nobody moved to catch it. "Julian," my mother said. The voice sounded far away already, and something in the flatness of it, the absence of actual alarm underneath the question, registered somewhere in the back of my collapsing mind as deeply wrong. My arms went next, a heavy, spreading numbness starting at my fingertips and climbing, and I remember trying to push my chair back from the table and finding that my hands simply wouldn't close around the armrests anymore. I looked at my father. He wasn't looking at me with fear. He was looking at me the way you look at a task you've been dreading and are relieved to finally start. "It's for the best, Julian," he said, standing, already moving around the table toward me. "You'll understand, eventually." I tried to say something. I don't know what a question. A protest. My brother's name. I genuinely don't remember. What came out was barely sound at all. My father grabbed my hand, my limp, useless, no longer mine hand. He shoved a pen between my fingers and pressed my palm flat against a document I couldn't focus my eyes on long enough to read. "Power of attorney," I heard him say, to my mother, not to me, "and the transfer of corporate rights." Both. Make sure both go through. My mother was crying. I want to note that, because I think about it more than almost anything else from that night. She was actually crying, real tears, while she watched her husband forge her son's signature across a document that would erase him. The last thing I saw before the room folded into black was Sebastian. He wasn't crying. He wasn't even watching my father's hands. He was looking at the folder sitting on the table beside my plate, the folder with 3 years of my life inside it, already reaching for it, like a man collecting something he'd simply been waiting his whole life to be handed. I woke up, strapped down, thought gently restrained, strapped, wrists bound to a bed frame with padded cuffs, a room around me painted the specific shade of institutional beige that exists nowhere else on Earth except places designed to make people forget what color looks like. My vision took a long time to clear. When it did, the first thing I saw was a clipboard, and behind it, a man in a white coat I didn't recognize, writing something without looking up. Where my voice came out, cracked, unused. "Where am I?" "Oak Ridge Psychiatric Facility," the man said, still writing. "I'm Dr. Thorne. You had a difficult few days, Julian." "I don't. This is wrong. I need to call someone. I need to call someone. I need to call Min." Krebs explained everything. "Dr. Thorne," Thorne said, finally looking up, and something in his eyes was worse than cruelty. It was boredom. The look of a man who had done this particular conversation many times before and already knew exactly how it ended. The delusions. The grandiose claims about designing a billion-dollar infrastructure system single-handedly. It's a common pattern, actually, with certain personality presentations. "We'll get you stabilized." "I did design it," I said, and heard, even as I said it, how the volume alone made me sound exactly like what he'd already decided I was. "I built the Apex grid. My brother didn't. He can't even read the core code. He doesn't know how any of it. That's the medication talking less than the belief system, unfortunately," Dr. Thorne said, making a note. "We'll adjust your dosage." He left. A nurse came in 20 minutes later with a syringe, and I felt the world go soft and distant again, and I understood, somewhere in that fading clarity, that fighting this out loud was only going to make the walls of it thicker. Days blurred into weeks. I lost the exact count somewhere in the second month, the medication making time move in a thick, syrupy way that resisted being measured. There was a television in the common room, bolted high on the wall, tuned permanently to a news channel none of the patients had chosen. I was sitting there heavily sedated, barely tracking the screen when Sebastian's face appeared on it. He was standing at a podium, our family's company logo behind him, a crowd of reporters, cameras flashing. "Incredibly proud to announce the Apex grid," he was saying, that same easy, practiced smile. 3 years of my life, honestly, more hours than I can count. It's been a passion project, and I think it's going to change how we build cities. 3 years of my life, I laughed. I want to be honest about that. It came out as a laugh, sharp and involuntary, loud enough that a nurse 2 seats over glanced up from her clipboard. "That's my project," I said, to no one, to the room, to the television. "I built that." "That's mine." "Sure it is, honey," the nurse said, not unkindly, in the specific tired tone reserved for patients whose delusions had become part of the furniture. Another patient near the window actually laughed, not cruelly, just reflexively, the way you laugh at something that's become a familiar bit in a place like this. I stopped talking after that, not because I'd given up. I want that distinction to be very clear. because it matters for everything that came after. I stopped talking because I finally understood the actual shape of the trap I was in. Screaming the truth in a place like this didn't sound like truth. It sounded like exactly the symptom they'd already diagnosed me with. Every time I insisted I was proving Dr. Thorne's chart correct in real time, feeding the exact narrative my parents had paid to create. So I stopped proving it. I let my shoulders drop. I let my voice go quiet and small in front of the staff. I started nodding along in group sessions, agreeing softly that my thinking had been grandiose, that I was working on accepting reality. I watched Dr. Thorne's notes shift week by week from agitated and delusional to showing improvement, increased compliance. I became, on paper, exactly the broken man they needed me to be. It took 6 weeks of that quiet performance before a nurse mentioned, almost as an afterthought while checking my chart, that patients showing improvement were eligible for supervised access to the art therapy room. Computers, she said, for design work. Very calming, apparently. I asked, in the flattest, most defeated voice I could manage, if I could try it. She smiled at me like I'd said something encouraging. 2 days later, they walked me down a fluorescent-lit hallway into a small room with 4 computers. Along one wall, a bored orderly reading a magazine in the corner, and more freedom sitting in front of me than I'd had in 6 weeks. I sat down, opened a blank drawing program, the kind meant for finger-painting therapy exercises. Then, with the orderly's eyes on his magazine and not on my screen, I minimized it and opened a command terminal instead. I looked at the blinking cursor for a long moment. Then I started typing. The first thing I had to relearn was patience measured in minutes instead of years. I had exactly 45 minutes of supervised computer access 3 times a week, with an orderly who had the same 3 magazines on rotation and checked my screen maybe once every 10 minutes. More out of habit than actual attention. 45 minutes, 3 times a week. I did the math on my first session and understood immediately that I wasn't writing this code in one sitting. I was writing in fragments. From memory. That was the part that saved me in the end, the part my parents never accounted for. I hadn't just designed the apex grid. I built it line by line over 3 years until the architecture of it lived somewhere behind my eyes, the way a language lives in someone who's spoken it since birth. I didn't need my old files. I needed a keyboard and 45 uninterrupted minutes, 3 times a week, and eventually enough of them stacked together. I wrote a backdoor, not into the hospital systems. Those weren't worth the risk, and I had no interest in escaping through a door that would just get me returned to a different, better locked version of this room. I wrote a backdoor into the apex grid itself, because I already understood, sitting in that fluorescent-lit room with a bored man 3 feet away flipping through a fishing magazine, exactly what Sebastian was going to do with my work. He was going to announce it, present it, put his name on it in front of the entire industry, because that was the only kind of contribution my brother had ever been capable of making, claiming things other people had already finished. So, I built a lock into my own creation, one that would answer to exactly one voice, in exactly one circumstance, mine. So the harder problem wasn't the code, it was getting it out of the building. I had no phone or internet access outside a heavily monitored therapy terminal that logged every keystroke for staff review, which meant I couldn't send anything directly, couldn't email, couldn't do anything that would show up in a log some overworked administrator might eventually glance at. So I hid it instead. I encoded the backdoor's activation packet inside what looked, to any casual observer, like a finger-painting file, a childish swirling digital drawing I made during actual approved art therapy time, the kind of harmless output Dr. Thorne's staff barely glanced at before filing away in a shared drive that occasionally, carelessly, synced to an outward-facing hospital server for family-sharing purposes. It took me 11 weeks to find the sync vulnerability. 11 weeks of quiet, medicated, compliant patients, nodding in group therapy, agreeing that my thinking had been unwell, while some other part of me sat coiled and awake behind all of it, waiting. When I finally found the gap, I didn't send the file to my parents. I sent it to Marcus Sterling. I'd researched him years earlier, back when I was still designing the Apex grid as a private citizen instead of a patient. Sterling Dynamics was Vance Architecture's largest rival, run by a man with a reputation for ruthlessness that made even my father speak his name carefully. I knew from old industry articles I'd half memorized in another life that Sterling's personal email address had been leaked once in a minor data breach years back, and never fully scrubbed from certain corners of the internet. I embedded a message inside the painting file's metadata. Just enough. A name, a location, a single line of the Apex Grid's core algorithm unmistakable to anyone who understood infrastructure mathematics and utterly meaningless to anyone who didn't. I'm the actual creator of the Apex Grid your rival is about to announce as his own. I'm currently held against my will at Oak Ridge Psychiatric Facility. This is not a delusion. Verify the code. Then come get me. I hit send during my 45 minutes on a Thursday, closed the file, opened the finger painting program back up, and drew a bowl of fruit for the orderly to answer approvingly on his way past. Then I waited. Marcus Sterling did not respond quickly. I want to be honest about that, because the waiting nearly broke the patience I'd spent months building. 4 days passed, then 6. I started to assume the message had been filtered as spam, or worse, flagged and quietly deleted by someone at Sterling Dynamics before it ever reached him personally. On the 9th day, a man in an expensive suit walked into Oak Ridge carrying a check for the facility's new wing. I heard about it before I stuck in the whole building shifted that morning, staff moving faster, Dr. Thorne himself putting on a fresh coat and combing his hair in a way I'd never once seen him bother with for actual patient. A donor tour. A nurse told us during morning meds, with the particular excitement reserved for anything that broke the routine. Very generous, very private. I was in the common room when he came through, flanked by 2 of Dr. Thorne's most eager staff members, nobbing along to a tour clearly designed to show off the facility's best angles. Marcus Sterling didn't look like what I expected. Not flashy, quiet, watchful. The kind of stillness that made a room reorganize itself around him without him needing to raise his voice. His eyes found me before I found a way to signal him. He didn't stop walking, didn't change his expression. Something passed over his face for exactly half a second. Recognition, calculation, confirmation, and I understood, in that half second, that the code sample in my message had done exactly what I'd hoped. He'd verified it. He knew. "I'd like a private moment with one of your patients," he said to Dr. Thorne, still smiling his donor smile. "As part of the Foundation's Patient Advocacy Review, standard procedure for facilities we're considering funding." Dr. Knurban. Thorne's face did something complicated, a flicker of alarm quickly smoothed over by the sight of the check still visible in Sterling's assistant's hands. "Of course," he said. "Which patient?" Sterling looked directly at me for the first time. "That one," he said. The private room they gave us had a camera in the corner, the small blinking kind meant to reassure families their loved ones were being monitored responsibly. Sterling noticed it before I could mention it. He reached up, unhurried, and placed a small device against the lens, something that made the light blink out entirely. "Jamming the feed," he said, sitting down across from me, setting a tablet on the table between us. "You have about 6 minutes before someone notices the camera's down and comes to check. Talk fast." I talked faster than I'd spoken in months. I told him everything: the dinner, the wine, the forged signature, 3 years of code Sebastian couldn't have written if his life depended on it. I watched Sterling's face while I talked, watched him run a piece of the algorithm I recited from memory against something on his tablet, watched his expression shift from professional skepticism into something colder and more focused. "This matches," he said finally, quiet, "the mine you sent me. It's in Sebastian's public demo materials, word for word, structure for structure. He's not smart enough to have written this. I've had my people study his public interviews for 2 years. He can't answer a basic load-bearing question without a script." "I know," I said. "I've watched the same interviews." Sterling looked at me for a long moment. "Your parents drugged you and forged a legal document to steal your life's work and hand it to your brother," he said, laying the facts out flat, the way you'd confirm a diagnosis. "And had you committed to keep you quiet, yes. That's not a family dispute," Stone said. "That's a felony. Multiple felonies." "I know that too," I said. "I've had a long time to think about exactly what it is." He closed the tablet. "I have lawyers who specialize in exactly this kind of case," he said. "And I have a personal, deeply held interest in watching Vance Architecture collapse before their launch. For reasons that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with a bid they stole from me 18 months ago. I think our interests happen to align, Julian." "They do," I said. "Then let's get you out of here." It took 11 days from that conversation to the raid. Sterling's legal team moved with a precision I found genuinely satisfying to watch, even second-hand subpoenas for Oak Ridge's financial records. A forensic accountant tracing wire transfers, a private investigator who found what turned out to be a shockingly sloppy paper trail from an offshore account with my parents' names still attached to the routing information, straight into Dr. Ma Thorne's personal accounts. The morning it happened, I was in group therapy, half listening to another patient describe a dream, when the door opened without a knock. 4 FBI agents, 2 of Sterling's attorneys, a woman with a badge who introduced herself as being from the State Medical Board. Dr. Thorne, one of the agents said, "You're under arrest for medical fraud, unlawful confinement, and conspiracy." I watched his face while they said it. Watched 6 months now of quiet, compliant performance finally pay off in the specific look of the man realizing too late that his patient had never actually stopped thinking. "Julian Vance," one of Sterling's attorneys said, crossing to me, kneeling slightly to speak at eye level. "Gentle. In a way, nothing had been gentle in this building for a very long time. You're free to go. We have a car outside." I stood up, reached for my cane, resting where it had been resting untouched for 8 months, propped uselessly against the wall because a straitjacket doesn't leave room for walking aids. It felt strange in my hand. Familiar and strange at once, the way your own name sounds strange if you say it too many times in a row. I walked out of Oak Ridge Psychiatric Facility on my own power, leaning on my own cane, past a common room full of patients who had spent 8 months believing I was exactly as broken as the file said I was. None of them looked up. I didn't need them to. Sterling's penthouse overlooked the Chicago skyline from 40 floors up, glass walls on 3 sides, the kind of view that made a person feel like they were standing above every problem they'd ever had instead of inside one. "So," Sterling said, pouring 2 glasses of something amber and expensive, handing me one, "now that you're out, what's the play? We sue. We go public with the medical records, the forged document, the wire transfers, and we bury Vance Architecture in litigation before their launch even happens." I didn't drink the glass right away, just held it, turning it slowly, watching the light move through it. "No," I said. Sterling raised an eyebrow. "No. If we sue now, it becomes a private legal matter. Sealed filings, a settlement negotiated behind closed doors, my parents' lawyers spinning it as a family disagreement that got unfortunately medicalized. Sebastian pays a fine eventually. Maybe in 3 years after an army of PR consultants finishes rebuilding his image. Like my parents keep their house, keep their circle, keep telling people I had a breakdown and they're just relieved I'm getting help now." "That's likely, yes," Sterling admitted. "I don't want a settlement," I said. "I want the whole world watching when it happens." I set the glass down, untouched. "There's something you don't know about the apex grid," I said. Something I never told anyone, because I didn't fully understand why I'd done it until I was strapped to a bed in that facility with nothing to do but think about it. Sterling waited. "A month before the dinner," I said, "I caught my father in my apartment. He said he was dropping off groceries. But I found him standing over my open hard drive with his phone out, photographing files he had no technical ability to understand. I didn't confront him. I just watched him leave, and I understood, somewhere underneath the part of me that still wanted to believe he was just being nosy, that something was coming." "So you prepared," Sterling said, understanding arriving fast, the way it does for people used to seeing 3 moves ahead. "I built a second version," I said. "A master file that looked identical to the real Apex grid on every service level. Same architecture, same interface, same demo results in every test environment small enough to run privately. It would pass every review Sebastian was capable of conducting because Sebastian has never once in his life understood what he was looking at. But," Sterling said, "but it contains a catastrophic mathematical flaw," I said, "buried deep in the load distribution calculations. Invisible at small scale, it only becomes fatal when the system connects to something operating at the scale of an actual city power grid, the exact scale of a global launch." Sterling set his own glass down slowly. "You gave them a bomb," he said, "and you're going to let them carry it onto a stage in front of the entire industry." "I'm not going to stop the launch," I said, and felt something settle into place in my chest as I said it, cold and certain, and finally, after 8 months, entirely my own decision. I'm going to let them have it. Let Sebastian stand up there in front of 50,000 people and every major investor on Earth and take credit for something he never understood, connected to a grid large enough to show exactly how little he understands it. And then And then, I'm going to be the one who turns it off, I said. On camera, in front of everyone, so there's no seal filing, no quiet settlement, no version of this story where my family gets to control what people remember. Sterling was quiet for a long moment, studying me the way he'd studied the code sample back at Oak Ridge, recalculating, recognizing something he respected more than he'd expected to. Remind me, he said finally, never to be the person you're patient with. You're not, I said. You're the person I needed. There's a difference. He almost smiled at that. The launch is in 6 weeks, he said. Chicago, global stream. Every major investor in architecture and infrastructure will be in that room or watching it live. Good, I said. Let's make sure I have access to every screen in the building. The 6 weeks between Sterling's penthouse and the launch passed in a strange, patient quiet that felt almost peaceful, in the way the eye of a storm is peaceful, not an absence of violence, just a very precise place to stand while it gathers around you. I spent most of it in a secured room in Sterling Dynamics' headquarters, working with a small team of his most trusted engineers to build the override sequence, the exact mechanism that would let me claim the stage, and the screens and the story at the precise moment it would do the most damage. I also spent it building something else, a file, every piece of evidence, time-stamped and organized with the specific, obsessive clarity of a man who had spent 8 months in a padded room learning exactly how thoroughly a story could be stolen from someone who couldn't prove otherwise. The original dated source code, 3 months before Sebastian's announcement, the forged power of attorney document alongside Sterling's handwriting expert's sworn analysis proving my signature had been guided by another hand while I was medically incapacitated. The wire transfers, small, quiet ones, moving from an offshore account with my parents' names still faintly attached into Dr. Thorne's private accounts, timed within days of my admission. And sitting on top of all of it, something Sterling's investigators had gotten in the final week, the piece I hadn't expected, but that landed the hardest once I had it. Dr. Thorne himself, in a recorded deposition given under threat of additional federal charges, describing in exact clinical language a diagnosis he had never believed, written for a patient he privately noted, in his own case file, showed no actual signs of the disorder he was medicated for. I had everything I needed. I just needed the room to be full when I used it. The launch day arrived cold and bright, the kind of clean Chicago sky that makes glass towers look like they're made of light instead of steel. I watched the auditorium fill on a monitor from a private room 2 floors below the stage, Sterling beside me, both of us dressed for a meeting. Neither of us was actually planning to attend in person. Investors from Dubai, from London, from Tokyo. 50,000 more watching the stream from wherever a screen and an internet connection happened to meet that morning. My parents seated in the front row, my mother in a dress that probably cost more than Dr. Thorne's entire hospital wing, my father's hand resting on her shoulder in the specific, practiced way of a man performing comfort per cameras he knew were on him. Sebastian took the stage to applause that started polite and grew, the particular sound of a room deciding to believe in someone before they've given any actual reason to. 3 years, he said into a microphone, in front of a project he had never once opened the source files of my life, of my vision. Today, we change how the world builds cities. He raised his hand toward the biometric scanner. I looked at Sterling. Now, I said. The scanner rejected his palm. The screen behind him, 40 feet tall, designed to bloom with 3 years of my mathematics, flashed instead into a violent, saturated red, and the mechanical voice I built specifically for this moment filled the auditorium with a calm that made the growing panic underneath it feel enormous. Authorization denied. Original creator override. Sebastian's hand stayed frozen against the glass. I watched, on my private monitor, the exact second his practiced smile failed to reload. Then my face replaced the red screens 40 feet tall, broadcasted to every camera in that building and every stream watching from outside it. "Hello, Sebastian," I said, and felt 8 months of silence unspool into something that finally, fully belonged to me. I let the auditorium sit in that confusion for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the wrongness to fully register. Not so long that panic curdled into something too chaotic to be useful. For those of you who don't recognize me, I said, my name is Julian. I designed the Apex grid. All of it. Every load calculation, every structural algorithm, every line of the system my brother is currently standing in front of and taking credit for. A murmur moved through the room, audible even through the feed, the particular sound of 50,000 people simultaneously reaching for their phones. 8 months ago, that continued, my parents poisoned my wine at what I believe was a celebration dinner. While I was medically incapacitated, my father forged my signature on a power of attorney document, transferring the rights to my work to my brother. I was then involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility where a doctor, paid by my parents, diagnosed me with a disorder he privately documented I did not have. I nodded, off-screen, to Sterling's technical team. The first document appeared beside my face, the time-stamped source code, dated 3 months before Sebastian's public announcement, my name embedded in every metadata field. This is the original file, I said. Timestamped, verified independently by Sterling Dynamics' forensic team. My brother has never opened a single one of these source files. He can't. He doesn't know how. The second document, the forged signature, side by side with an authenticated sample of my actual handwriting, the deviation circled in red by an expert's careful hand. This is the document my father forced my paralyzed hand to sign. The third, wire transfers, offshore accounts, names that were, until that moment, only whispered about at country clubs, now sitting in bright, undeniable text on a screen 40 feet tall. And this, I said, is the payment my parents made to keep me quiet. I could see it. Even through the small preview window of the auditorium's crowd camera, my father's face losing color in real time, my mother's hand rising to her mouth. The specific physical collapse of two people watching a story they'd spent 8 months building come apart in under 90 seconds. Sebastian, I said, and let his name land alone in the silence for a moment. You stood on this stage a moment ago about to activate a system you've never once understood. I let you steal it. I want you to understand that clearly. I let this happen because I needed the whole world watching when I showed you exactly what happens when you build an empire on something you never actually built. I nodded again. Activate the grid, I said, to my own system now, not to him. Let's show them. The 3D models that had been meant to bloom triumphantly across those screens did activate, just not the way anyone in that room had rehearsed for. The simulated city grid lit up first in confident blue, exactly as designed, exactly as every small-scale test had shown for 8 months, while Sebastian's team ran demonstrations that never once approached the true scale of a global launch. Then, as the simulation scaled to match the size of an actual functioning city grid, the specific scale I had engineered the dummy file to only fail at the blue began flickering red at the low points, slowly at first. The stress fracture in the mathematics, precisely where I'd hidden it, precisely calculated to hold in any test small enough for Sebastian to have ever run. Then faster, the towers in the simulation began to visibly buckle, load calculations cascading into failure across the entire grid, the exact structural collapse my Sabotage had been engineered to demonstrate in front of the only audience that would understand what they were watching, an auditorium full of the most sophisticated infrastructure investors on Earth. Plymouth gas. Someone standing. A phone dropped somewhere near the front, a small clatter of it, audible even over the rising noise. This, I said, calm, letting the collapsing simulation speak alongside me, is what my brother was about to launch globally. A structural failure that would have activated the moment this system connected to an actual city power grid. I want to be very clear about what that would have meant. Not a stock dip, not a bad headline. Real buildings, real people. A catastrophic failure engineered into a system my family stole and had no ability to verify, because verifying it would have required understanding it. Sebastian was still standing at the podium, hand no longer raised, mouth open around words that weren't arriving. I'm not sorry for letting you get this far, I said to him, directly, the auditorium utterly silent now, except for the low, mechanical groan of the collapsing simulation still playing behind him. I needed everyone in this room, and everyone watching this stream, to see exactly what you were about to do with something that was never yours. Federal agents entered from both sides of the stage 11 seconds later, Sterling's timing. Coordinated weeks in advance with agencies who had been building a fraud case since the day Dr. Doll. Thorne's deposition landed in their hands. Sebastian didn't run. I think, watching it back later, that some part of him understood there was nowhere in that room, or in his entire life, left to run to. Sebastian Vance, one of the agents said, loud enough to carry. You're under arrest for securities fraud, conspiracy, and international investor fraud. They let him off the stage in view of every camera in the building, past investors already on their phones with lawyers, past the wreckage of a launch that had taken 8 months of my silence to fully arrive. Glance Architecture's stock, which had opened that morning at a valuation north of $2 billion, began its collapse before the agents had even reached the exit doors. By the closing bell, it was worth 11 cents a share. By the end of the week, it was delisted entirely. Sebastian was sentenced, 7 months later, to 30 years in federal prison for international corporate fraud. The mathematics of his own ignorance, laid out so plainly in that auditorium, leaving his defense team almost nothing to argue with. Though my parents' assets were seized within the year, the government moving methodically through offshore accounts, the house, the cars, everything built on a company that no longer existed, and a fraud case that named them as co-conspirators from the very first filing. The Richard took a job managing inventory at a hardware store outside the city. Evelyn, I heard, worked retail for a while before the stress of being recognized in public became too much, and she stopped leaving the house most days. I didn't chase any of that. I want to be honest about that part. I didn't need to watch it happen to feel finished with it. Sterling's legal team handled the aftermath. I went back to work. They came to my new office 11 months after the launch. I didn't know they were downstairs until my assistant knocked, hesitant, telling me there was an older couple in the lobby refusing to leave, saying they were my parents. I almost said no. I sat with that decision for a long moment, my cane resting against the edge of my new desk in the glass-walled office overlooking the same Chicago skyline that had watched their empire dissolve 11 months earlier. Then I said, send them up. They looked smaller than I remembered, not just old or diminished, in the specific way people get when every external structure that used to hold their posture up has been removed at once. My father's suit didn't fit him the way it used to. Though my mother wasn't wearing jewelry. They didn't sit when I gestured toward the chairs. They knelt, right there, on the floor of my office, my mother's hands reaching toward me, my father's head down in a way I had genuinely never once seen it, not even that night at the dinner table, when he'd forced a pen into my paralyzed hand. Like Julian, my mother said, voice breaking, please, we made a mistake, a terrible mistake. We're your parents. Please. I looked at them for a long time, long enough that I think they mistook my silence for consideration. I looked down at my legs, the legs that had needed a cane since I was a child, the legs my parents had spent my entire life treating as a stain on a family photograph, the legs that had, 8 months into a locked psychiatric ward, still managed to walk me out the front door under my own power the moment the door was finally opened. Then I looked at them, kneeling, needing me to lift them up. It seems, I said, quiet, my legs work better than yours do right now. I pressed the intercom. Security, I said. Though my parents are ready to leave. I stand at that same window most evenings now, the Chicago skyline stretched out golden glass in front of me, my cane resting against my hand, not as something I've learned to hide, but as the one piece of my life nobody was ever able to take from me. Not with wine, not with Rhine, not with a straight jacket, not with a diagnosis paid for in offshore transfers. Sterling Dynamics and Vance Architecture's remains merged 8 months ago under a new name, with my name on the patents this time, spelled out fully, unambiguously, in every filing that matters. I built an empire once already, quietly alone, in an apartment no one bothered to visit. I built it again after that, from a padded room 45 minutes at a time, 3 days a week, entirely from memory. Nobody is stealing this version. I made sure of that too,